A young woman never came home from work, and her parents immediately knew something was wrong. Once detectives stepped in, they were met with a scene of real horror. And right away, several entire evening shift at the restaurant, which wasn't supposed to end until after midnight. The next morning, her fiancé was on his way to work at another restaurant, and his route took him past Terry's house. By then, she should have killed her. Once he realized what he'd done, he started thinking about how to avoid getting caught. That's when he decided to stage a robbery. He took money from the safe and from Terry's purse, then climbed out of the restaurant through the drive-through window. The next morning, he deliberately drove past Terry's house and acted alarmed when he saw her car wasn't there. It was his way of steering suspicion away from himself, making it look like he had noticed something was wrong purely by chance. For the next 15 years, he managed to avoid punishment. But now, with the DNA results and his confession, Alfred was finally charged. That happened on the same day, the 15th anniversary of Terry's murder, and later he formally pleaded guilty. In 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he remains behind bars to this day. For Terry's family, the news of Alfred's arrest came as a real shock. Every one of them had seen him as kind, caring, and harmless. But the reality turned out to be far darker. He had brutally murdered his fiancée simply because she decided to leave him, and then spent the next 15 years living freely, as if nothing had happened. It's also worth noting that after the murder, Terry's father filed a civil lawsuit against the restaurant's management. He argued that the restaurant was located in an area where thefts were common, and it had been robbed before, yet management still failed to provide an adequate level of security for its employees, and never warned Terry about those risks. Even so, it's still unclear exactly how that ended. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. And don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching. Been home asleep after her shift. But when Alfred drove by, he noticed her car wasn't there. That immediately felt wrong. Terry should have been back home around 2:00 a.m., and by the time Alfred passed the house, it was around 6:00 in the morning. So there was no obvious reason she would have gone anywhere. He stopped and went inside to talk to her parents, who said they hadn't seen Terry since the day before. Then they checked her room and quickly realized she hadn't come home at all. The bed was still made, and the things she normally took with her to work were missing. Terry's father immediately called the restaurant where she worked. He figured maybe she'd gotten stuck there for some reason and was still at the restaurant. But when someone answered, it was a man he didn't recognize. The man told him Terry had been found dead, and police were already on the scene. What had happened was this. The morning shift manager had arrived at the restaurant around 6:00 a.m. and was getting ready to open up. But when he walked back into the kitchen, he found Terry's body on the floor, and it was instantly clear she had been brutally murdered. Terry was lying on her back in a pool of blood with a kitchen knife stuck in her neck. On top of that, there were a lot of abrasions on her body, which pointed to a prolonged struggle, and there was a trash bag over her head. Later, medical examiners found signs that the killer had first tried to strangle her with his hands, but failed. The same seemed to be true of the knife. Even though the tip of the blade had actually bent as it came back out of her body, which showed just how much force had been used, that wound still wasn't what killed her. According to the pathologist, Terry may have been paralyzed first, and only then did the killer take the bag and pull it over her. Possible suspects emerged, but with almost no evidence to work with, the case went cold for years. Then 15 years later, one small detail that had gone ahead, causing her death. So, from the very beginning, police understood that Terry had not been killed quickly. Whoever did this had spent a significant amount of time attacking her. They also noticed that she was wearing her jacket, which made detectives think the killer may have confronted her as she was leaving work. That theory seemed to fit with another detail, too. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere at the restaurant. By that point, all the other employees had already left, and Terry was supposed to lock the doors behind him and then get the place ready for the next day. Investigators also found that the safe in the manager's office was open and about $2,500 was missing. Because of that, police believed robbery was the motive. In their view, the killer may have approached Terry as she was leaving the restaurant and forced her back inside, threatening her until she opened the safe. After that, he attacked her, and after a long struggle, he killed her. Maybe he did it because he didn't want her identifying him. Or maybe Terry tried to fight back or call for help. Police also noticed that the contents of Terry's purse had been dumped out onto the floor next to her body, and the cash was gone. It looked like the killer emptied it after the murder, then fled the scene. Investigators also noted that the drive-through window had been lifted slightly open, since it could only be opened from the inside the restaurant. They assumed the robber had climbed out that way for some reason. Crime scene. Tags collected fingerprints and other potential evidence. But there was one obvious problem. This was a restaurant with a lot of foot traffic, so separating the killer's prints from those of employees and customers was incredibly difficult. The medical examiner, though, found something much more specific. Under Terry's fingernails, there was blood and skin particles that most likely belonged to the killer. It looked like she had scratched him during the struggle. But there was a catch. DNA testing wasn't being used yet, so detectives couldn't do anything with that evidence at the time. No other useful evidence was found at the scene, and investigators were, unnoticed all that time, ended up turning the entire investigation on its head and revealing a truth no one saw coming. Terry Lynn Brooks was born on September, left trying to figure out how they were going to identify the person responsible. Restaurant robberies were fairly common back then, but they rarely ended in murder, especially one this brutal. Because of that, detectives started considering another possibility, that the killer may have known Terry and may have had personal motives. Of course, the first suspect was her fiancé, Alfred. He told police that he would usually stop by Terry's restaurant after closing because he didn't like the idea of her being there alone that late at night. Considering she was there with all that cash the restaurant had made that day, the place looked like an easy target for robbers. That night, though, Alfred had gone to bed early because he had an early shift the next morning at another restaurant. He blamed himself for not going there that night and not being able to protect Terry. Police spoke with Terry's family and asked whether there had been any problem in her relationship with Alfred, but her parents said the two of them were happy, busy planning their wedding, and almost never argued. They described Alfred as a kind, caring man who would never have hurt her, so police didn't find any serious reason to suspect the fiancé. But before long, they came across a much more interesting possible suspect. As detectives spoke with people who knew Terry, they learned that in general, she got along well with the employees she supervised. But if someone wasn't doing their job properly, she could be pretty strict. Her co-workers said that the most troublesome employee had been a cook named Steve, whom Terry had fired just a few weeks before the murder. According to them, Steve was extremely hot-tempered and aggressive. He was constantly causing conflict, doing a poor job, and at one point had even started yelling at Terry when she confronted him about his behavior. And that wasn't all. Other employees said Steve kept coming to the restaurant even after he was fired, only now as a customer. At the time, they felt like he was doing it for one reason only: to get under Terry's skin. Detectives started thinking that Steve may have actually been planning revenge. He not only had a motive to commit the crime, he also knew the exact routine of the evening shift. 13th, 1958, in Pennsylvania. She was the oldest of 4 children, and from an early age she had to help her parents take care of the younger kids. After high school, Terry went to college when all the other employees left and Terry was left alone in the restaurant. So, in the detectives' eyes, Steve started looking very suspicious, and they brought him in for questioning. Didn't deny that he disliked Terry, and even added that if she hadn't been a woman, he would have hit her. But Steve insisted he hadn't killed anyone. According to him, he had been somewhere else that night. He said he had been trying to get into a nightclub, but they wouldn't let him in. He gave detectives the address and they spoke to the staff there, but no one could remember seeing Steve. That only made detectives more suspicious. So, they asked him to take a polygraph test. Steve agreed, and to the police's surprise, the examiner didn't detect a single deceptive answer. Even though a polygraph is far from a perfect tool, it still made detectives question whether Steve was actually guilty, and they started looking into other leads. They decided to examine every employee who had worked with Terry that night. In the detectives' view, one of them could have stayed behind in the restaurant, then attacked her and taken the money. By then, experts had already collected the fingerprints from the restaurant and started comparing them to the employees' prints. And that's when police found something interesting. Of course, they expected the workers' fingerprints to be all over the place, but one employee's prints were found on the very trash bag that had been pulled over Terry's head, and also on the drive-through window, which investigators believed the killer may have used to escape. Police immediately brought him in for questioning, but he denied any involvement. He explained that every night before the end of his shift, he would gather the trash and take it out, touching the roll of trash bags multiple times. He also gave detectives an alibi, and they were able to confirm that he had in fact left the restaurant before Terry did. So once again, police were left with nothing. But 2 weeks later, everything changed. Also working in different cafes and restaurants, somewhere along the way, she realized this was the career she actually wanted. Terry hoped to grow in the restaurant business and eventually work her way into senior management at another restaurant from the same chain, not far from where Terry worked. A very similar crime took place. The assistant manager was alone in the restaurant when she came out of the bathroom and was suddenly attacked by a man. He beat her, then ran off, and the woman went to the police. Investigators believed he had come there to rob the place, but she had interrupted him and scared him off. Police couldn't ignore how similar that case felt to Terry's murder. Even though in this case, the victim had survived, still, she hadn't gotten a good look at the attacker's face, and he hadn't left any evidence behind. A few days later, investigators learned about another crime in a town called Scranton, about 120 miles from Terry's workplace. A restaurant employee named Kathy was alone in the building when an intruder got inside. He demanded money, but she told him it had already been locked in the safe, and she didn't know the combination. So, the attacker took Kathy's own money and valuables, then led her into the bathroom and stabbed her to death. At that point, detectives on Terry's case started wondering if they were dealing with a serial robber, someone willing to kill without hesitation. And before long, police in Scranton arrested a suspect. It turned out to be an employee from that very restaurant. The man had decided to rob his own workplace. He watched the restaurant from a distance, waiting until all the other employees were gone, and the victim was left there, alone. But he hadn't realized that by then, the money would already be in the safe instead of the register, and that she wouldn't be able to open it for him. In the end, he killed her anyway because she would have been able to identify him easily. The detectives in Terry's case immediately went to speak with him, but the man refused to answer their questions. Even so, they were able to get his fingerprints, and they didn't match any of the prints found in Terry's restaurant. That didn't rule him out for sure, but detectives understood they had no real way to tie him to Terry's murder, so there was nothing they could do with him. Over the next several major chain, at one of those restaurants, Terry met a man named Alfred, who worked there as a cook, and the two of them started dating. Not long after that, he proposed, and they began making plans for their wedding as well. Months. Police kept trying to find new leads, but time after time, they hit dead ends, and eventually the case was pushed aside. That's where it stayed for the next 14 years until a new chief took over at the local police department. He told detectives to go back through the unsolved murders, and they reopened Terry's case. By then, DNA testing was being widely used in criminal investigations. So, police sent the samples from under Terry's fingernails and the knife itself to the lab, hoping something new would come of it. The experts were able to pull a profile of an unknown man from the bits of skin left under Terry's nails during the struggle. But that wasn't all. They also took apart the knife that had been used to stab her, and underneath the handle, they found DNA from the same man. So, there was still no genetic database at the time. So, detectives had to try to identify the DNA owner on their own. They started reaching back out to everyone connected to the case, trying to get DNA samples from possible suspects and rangering people in case someone suddenly remembered something new. One of those people was the former manager of the restaurant, and police asked him to come down to the station. They asked him once again to go over everything he knew about Terry and her role at the restaurant. Since 14 years had passed, detectives decided to show him several crime scene photos to help refresh his memory. The former manager looked at them and suddenly noticed one detail that had gone overlooked all those years, and that completely changed the whole picture. The manager said Terry was always meticulous about keeping things in order, and over time, she had developed a routine. Before leaving the restaurant, she would tidy up her desk, putting documents and, office supplies back in their proper places, and she would also empty the ashtray that sat in the office. But in the crime scene photos, it was obvious she hadn't done any of that night. And that changed everything. As a honeymoon in Hawaii, By 1984, when she was 25, Terry was working at a Roy Rogers restaurant in Bucks County. From the very beginning, she had her sight set on moving up, and she worked hard for it. Remember, the detective's original theory had been this. Terry was leaving work, and somewhere near the door, the killer jumped her. But now, after hearing what her manager said, detectives realized Terry hadn't even finished straightening up her workplace yet, and she never would have gone home without doing that first. So, if the killer was already inside the restaurant, while Terry was still there with the doors locked, then one explanation stood out above all the others. Terry may have let him in herself. And if that was true, then she must have known him well, and trusted him. Once detectives realized that, they shifted their focus to Terry's inner circle, and started re-entering the people closest to her. During that process, they came across a woman named Cindy, one of Terry's closest friends. For some reason, police had never spoken to her back in those early years. But now, 14 years later, she gave detectives some very interesting information. When they asked whether Terry had any enemies or ongoing conflicts, Cindy said there was one person Terry was afraid of. Her fiancé, Alfred. According to Cindy, just a week before the murder, Terry had confessed that she was thinking about calling off the wedding, but she was afraid of how Alfred would react. She said that with each passing month, he had become more and more jealous and was trying to control practically every part of her life. He didn't want her going anywhere without him, constantly demanding to know where she was. And whenever she pushed back, he would get aggressive. On top of that, Alfred hated his own job, but wasn't doing anything to change his situation, while Terry was actively working her way up and making big plans for the future. That clearly bothered him and only made his resentment worse. Cindy also revealed something else. Because of that effort, she was promoted to manager pretty quickly, but the promotion also meant working evening shifts. Even so, Terry was happy about it and had no intention of stopping there. By early 1984, Terry was still We remember Alfred had said he came by the restaurant almost every night because he was worried about Terry's safety. But according to Terry, that wasn't the real reason at all. He came in there to keep tabs on her, to make sure she wasn't spending time with anyone else. That changed the whole direction of the case. The original detectives had never known any of this because they had never spoken to Cindy. Apparently, Terry had kept her doubts about the wedding hidden even from her parents, so they still believed everything between her and Alfred was perfectly fine, and they described him only in positive terms. Because of that, police had formed a distorted picture of the relationship, and never treated the fiancé as a primary suspect. But now, with the victim's friend finally talking, Alfred immediately became suspect number one, and detectives focused on getting his DNA. They learned that in the 14 years since Terry's death, Alfred had gotten married and had a child. But that marriage didn't last, and by the time detectives reopened the case, he was back living with his parents, the same place where he'd been living when Terry was killed. The investigators decided to move carefully so they wouldn't scare him off. At that point, there still wasn't a single direct piece of evidence against Alfred. So, if he realized police were looking at him for Terry's murder, he could have run. So, instead, they chose a quieter approach and secretly obtained his DNA. They learned that Alfred was a smoker and waited for him to take the trash out from his house. After that, they retrieved the bag, found several cigarette butts inside, and sent them to the lab. Experts pulled saliva from the filters, and DNA testing showed it belonged to the same person as the skin found under Terry's fingernails, and a sample recovered from the knife handle. So, detectives finally had confirmation that Alfred was the one who attacked his fiancée that night, and on the exact 15th anniversary of the murder, they brought him in. They didn't show Al working at the restaurant and getting ready for the wedding. She and Alfred were also looking for their first place together. But until then, Terry was still living with her parents. On February 3rd, Terry headed to her usual their cards right away. They were hoping to get a confession. To achieve that, they told him they were just reviewing the old case and talking to everyone that had been connected to it. Alfred agreed to answer their questions, and at first, everything was calm. Then, once the detectives finished the usual background questions, they asked if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. The examiner flagged deception on the key questions, And when detectives told Alfred that he started getting visibly nervous, they also asked him to provide a DNA sample, and he agreed to that too. Panicking even more. Seeing how rattled he was, detectives started pressing harder and directly accused him of killing Terry. Alfred kept denying any involvement, but he was spiraling more and more into full-blown panic. At one point, he suddenly blurted out that he hadn't meant to do it, then immediately tried to take it back. A moment later, he shouted, "She attacked me first," which sounded about as close to a confession as detectives could have hoped for. So they kept the pressure on, and when they finally confronted him with the DNA results, Alfred broke. Admitted that just like usual, he had gone to Terry's restaurant after all the other employees had already left, and she let him inside. At some point, they started talking about their relationship, and the conversation turned into an argument. Terry told him she didn't want to marry him, and that was enough to make him snap. He hit her, and the two of them started struggling. Terry tried to push him away, but Alfred managed to knock her to the floor. After that, he kept beating her and then tried to strangle her. But when that didn't work, he noticed a kitchen knife on the floor, one that had apparently fallen off the table during the fight. He grabbed it and stabbed her in the neck, but even that didn't kill her. Realizing Terry was still alive, Alfred took a trash bag and pulled it over her head, and that was what finally